So thank you all again for joining us this Friday morning. We have a great talk on HERS this morning with our team, and this will be the fifth in our series on the new G code. We will follow the same format we've been in the past, where we have a presentation for about an hour, and then we'll have a half an hour at the end for questions. And so we really appreciate.
Hello. Hi. Hi, I'm
not in it.
sorry, I'm just there.
Thanks. So if everyone, as you're coming in, if you can just mute, we'll ask you, to put questions in the chat as we go. We'll pick those up at the end to discuss, and then also if you can unmute and ask questions at the end too. But always helpful to just kind of roll through. I'm sure there'll be questions, as there have been on so many of these. So thank you all. We'll get started. Probably give everyone another minute or two to come in. Friday mornings always running a little slow, so if just settle in and we will start soon. Also, if you need continuing education credits, we will put the form in the chat here in 1 second. Okay, well, as everyone joins, we can just get started. Appreciate everyone joining us this morning. Happy Friday mornings, and this is our fifth of our DOER stretch code discussions, and as we've said on all of them to this point, this is put on by the Sustainable Design Leaders of Boston, the BSA, both my group, the COTE group, which is the Committee on the Environment, and the Codes group. And we really appreciate the support of all of those memberships and all of the energy and time they've put in. But also to say we are not code officials, nor do any of us work for the DOER. So we really, we're just doing this to show what we've been going through with the new code and how we understand it, and to the best of our knowledge. So please forgive us if we misstep. We will do our best to correct ourselves, and we really appreciate everyone taking part in this. So with no further ado, I can move through. As we have discussed, if you've been on any of these other talks, you'll have seen we have our outline of the talk. So we start with just a bit of an overview, then we'll go into the expectations of HERS, the design process, the construction process, and then have our team take you through some case studies. And as always, we finish up with the question and some resources. And if you didn't hear me say in the beginning, we're going to spend about an hour on the talk, and then we'll have a half an hour for questions. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat or save them to the end, and we'll ask you to unmute to ask your question. Slide. So yes, you've seen me, my name on a number of these, and Allison. My name is Laura Fott. I am the co-chair of the Committee on the Environment, and I work for Feingold Alexander Architects. Allison Nash, my fellow moderator, works with Sasaki and is the leader of the Sustainable Design Leaders in Boston area. And today our speakers are Mark Newey from New Ecology, Mark Doughty from Thought Forms, and Michelle Pagan from Icon.
Exercise.
So really
Oh,
appreciate everyone being here, and we really appreciate Mark, and Michelle's time for walking us through hers. Next slide, please. Next slide. We'll take you through the timeline and overview. I think everyone has seen this amazing map that is ever changing. This is, I believe, the most up to date. I went on last night, so unless something as new has changed, this is our map of Massachusetts and our municipalities and where they fall. If they are in the base energy code, which is 51 towns, stretch energy code are 280 towns, and then those that are getting into the opt-in or specialized energy code, which we're at 17 at this point. Those are listed below. And as we will discuss, there is a bit of a rolling time frame for when those opt-ins take effect. And you can get all of that information at this Mass.gov website that is in the bottom left, and you can also dig into this map a little more there. Next slide, please. So again, just a bit of a reminder, Massachusetts, we have, depending on what municipality you're working in, we have three buckets three buckets of what code you'd be applying. If you're in one of those 50 non-stretch communities, you will be in just the base energy code, which there will be the 10th Amendment coming out. If you are in a green community, you will, that approximately 300 communities, you will be in the stretch energy code. And if you're doing a purely residential project, that stretch energy code is already in effect. It went in effect January 1, and commercial will be going in effect in 2 weeks now, which is why we wanted to have this talk. And then, as I mentioned, the 17 communities that have already adopted the specialized code or opt-in code, as it's sometimes called. And if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the timeline. Oh, I'm sorry, just the other, no, you're fine. I jumped ahead. So again, just another way of looking at that, the regular energy code, the updated stretch energy code, or the specialized code, and really where that takes you. This is, everyone learns a little bit differently. So really, how do we look at this? Which one of these codes do we go to? Where do we find that? The IECC 2021 versus the stretch energy code, and then talking through what those compliance pathways are for each, for once you've fallen into each of those stretch energy codes. And then if we go on, we know that there are many, not everything is just a new building. There is alterations, which as defined by changes to the building that are not subsidence addition, just altering a portion. And what that means, we've walked this through from our side of things. We've created a number of overviews to help us understand what performance pathway and what applies. And then additions, the addition, this one's a little more complicated. In addition, depending on if you're residential or if you're commercial. In this case, we're laying out commercial. So saying if you're adding an addition that is 100% the size of the building. So say it was a 15,000 square foot building and you're adding a 15,000 square foot addition, then that would move you into the new energy code. If it's less than the 100% the size of the building and less than 20,000 square feet, you follow the addition section. Now, if we're talking about residential, that number is a bit different. It is 1,000 square foot addition, not the 20,000. And then change of use, we understand that change of use is change from, say, an office building to residential, or from a change of occupancy use. And if that change of use does not increase the fuel consumption, then we believe that we understand that you still fall into the same energy path. But if you do change your energy consumption, then you're going to be a new construction prescription compliance. So you're going to follow needing to follow the compliance of the new energy code. If you if you're only not changing the energy use, then you just have to follow the lighting power density. And then if you're there's some exemptions about the window to wall, and then making sure you're not increasing the window to wall under a change of use. So please, check back to the technical guidance about each of these, but this is our general overview of how to fall between those. Next slide. And then this is that timeline that I referenced earlier. As I mentioned, the technical guidance was released in December, just before we went into the residential code taking effect in January, this past January. We know that towns started having their warrant articles for the opt-in code, and which has put us in the 17 municipalities that have adopted that opt-in code. And that opt-in code takes effect 6 to 11 months later. So at least 6 months, depending on when it was, when the town approved it, it would either fall on July 1 or January 1. And there is documents with that map that we showed earlier that will show you exactly when each municipality falls in. So here we are just before July, getting ready for the commercial stretch energy code to come in place, and the base energy code with amendments, and then the opt-in multifamily coming into place for a few of our communities that got in early. And then, as we know, moving into January, we'll have a few more of the communities that have opted in that made it in place at that point. And then finally, we know that in July, a year, just slightly more than a year from now, we'll be lowering our HERS values. So, which is a great place for us to kick off and hand it over to our team to discuss what we expect from her. So I believe, Mark, this is you, and thank you all for your time.
Great, thank you. So here is a table showing us HERS index requirements if you use what's called the ERI path, Energy Rating Index path. And that's really the focus of today's presentation. I was talking about that path. And there's a lot of different types of buildings that may choose to use this path. And depending on the code you're under, you may be required to use this path. So I just say there's a lot of different roads that lead you to this table, but it's the same table no matter how you got there. So this table is used for single family homes. It's also used for multifamily buildings that are using the ERI path. So we have HERS indexes here that, if you're not too familiar with HERS indexes, a HERS index is a relative performance value. It's sort of saying, if you got a 100 HERS index, then you would have a building that meets the minimum requirements of the 2006 energy code. So that wouldn't be very good for today, which is why you're seeing numbers lower than that. So a 52 HERS index only uses 52% as much energy as a 100 index. And so we're seeing these numbers come down over time. So the requirement has been and will continue to be for another year, these indexes in the 50s. And you can see that the index you need depends on whether you have a mixed fuel building, which means electricity plus a fossil fuel, or more than one fossil fuel. So that might be a natural gas heated building, or a building with a natural gas water heater, or a propane water heater. And then we have an index if you also have solar, and you can see that instead of a 52, a 55 is acceptable. The idea being that a higher index is a little bit of a break. It's a little bit of an easier number to hit. these are indexes prior to considering the impact of solar on the index itself. So you would need a 55 HERS index prior to putting the solar on the roof. And then there's a 55 index if the building is all electric. And then a 58 if it's both all electric and you have solar. And solar has particular thresholds for how many kilowatts you need, depending whether it's single family or multifamily. And so those indexes are pretty similar to what we've been using for a number of years now. But you can see that in a year, next July, those indexes drop 10 points. And I can't overemphasize how big a deal that drop in index is, because this is a whole energy use index. And that means that it includes things like plug loads. People are going to plug things into the outlets in the home. And there's other things that you don't have a lot of control over when you build a building. And so our HERS index can't really go much below 30 because we still have to heat the house. We still need to cool it. We still need hot water, and people still need to be able to plug things into the outlets. So you can't really get much below 30, maybe high 20s. And so when we drop from a 52 to a 42, that's almost half of the energy losses that still exist. And so it's a pretty big increase in efficiency to go from a 52 to a 42. So you can see those indexes. We have a year before that goes into effect, but as we know, it's based on the building permit date, and you may already be designing buildings that will permit after July 2024. So we can't really think of this as something that happens later. It happens now from a design standpoint if you don't know yet when you'll have a building permit, or if you think it'll be after that date. There's a little bit different index in the right-hand column for existing buildings. So that would be alterations, additions, or change of use. Interestingly, that's the same index as a new building as of today, and it's just that next July the number doesn't drop 10 points. So in some ways, the hardest part about the stretch in our stretch codes right now is the existing building index, HERS index, because it's already asking for existing buildings to be brought to the same level of efficiency as new buildings. They won't be asked next year to get even more efficient than that, but these can be challenging numbers to hit. Next, yeah, great. So how do you get a HERS index? You have to hire a HERS rater. It's a specialized certified role. And there's a national organization called ResNet that oversees the training, certification, and quality assurance of HERS raters. Each HERS rater or HERS rating company is an independent provider. And you can get proposals from multiple HERS raters. There's probably, 150 different companies around the state that provide HERS rating services. They range from one person in their car driving around to large companies that might have 20 HERS raters providing these services. And the minimum needed to do a HERS rating is that you got to calculate some areas, type a bunch of data into a computer software program, look at the house when you insulate it, and test the house at the end, like a blower door test, for example. But you can do a lot more too. And so what I've done in this list here is kind of give you a sense of what a comprehensive set of HERS rater services looks like. Some HERS raters will provide early design preliminary ratings. So maybe you have just a schematic design and you want to have a sense, where am I going to land? I don't have all the details yet, but I want to know if I'm on track for a HERS 42, because I know that that's tough. And then pretty much any HERS rater needs to provide a final preliminary rating for you to pull a building permit. Some will provide a pre-construction meeting with your contractor to walk them through everything that they're going to be looking for. Some will provide a foundation inspection. Some will provide a framing or air sealing or HVAC and rough inspection during construction. And then every HERS rater will provide an installation inspection and a final inspection with testing. So I recommend asking questions when you get these HERS rating proposals about which of these services it includes, especially when we look at a big step in the requirements. The more help you can get, and the more help you can get for your contractor, and the more early design assistance you can get, the more sure you're going to be that you're going to hit those. And I see a question about what are the goals of the HERS Rater's foundation inspection. Typically, when that step exists, it's to look at any insulation that might be on the outside of the foundation walls or under the foundation slab, as well as a chance to talk about things that are going to happen early in construction that haven't happened yet. So what are some things about the framing of the home that need to be considered now that that's about to start? Next slide. So there is a Mass Save new construction program in Massachusetts, and here is a website for that. Homes that are 1 to 4 units can get incentives through this program, and multifamily buildings that have individual systems, individual meters for all the units that are 1 to 3 stories can use this. There's also a high-rise version of it for taller buildings and buildings with master meters. And on this site, there's a link for all the HERS rating companies in the state that have registered with Mass Save. And so it's a great way to figure out who can you reach out to get a quote for HERS rating services. And they provide incentives which could range from a few $100s all the way up to $10,000, depending on how energy efficient the home is, how much energy the home saves. Next slide. There is also a renovations and additions version of the Mass Save new construction program. And I think this is really key because those ERI path can be used, or in some cases must be used, for additions, renovations, alterations, change of use. You're looking at really achieving a new construction level of energy performance in an existing building. That is a challenge that you don't want to overlook. And there are HERS rating companies that specialize in that kind of thing. And that's a good way to reach them is to come to this Mass Save renovations and additions site. And they have a list of HERS rating companies that focus on renovations and additions. And you'll definitely want to get a lot of preliminary help in terms of analyzing the design and potentially looking at the existing building to make sure that you know what you need to do to hit those HERS targets. The Mass Save program provides incentives based on the savings you achieve compared to the existing building. And just like the new construction program, that can be up to $10,000. And if you're doing a gut renovation, a lot of projects do achieve savings in the higher range of that incentive range. Next slide. Great. So you're getting a HERS rating. The HERS rater is going to tell you what index you're getting, but how do they come up with that index? Well, the software program they're using, there's two ones out there that are in most use, which are Ecotrope and REMrate. These are programs where it's essentially calculating on an hour-by-hour basis over a typical year how much energy will be needed to heat and cool, to provide hot water, to provide the lights, appliances, and plug loads. And there's probably, I don't know, there's several hundred inputs into the software, but I like to think of it as these are the main categories. In blue, we have things that affect heating and cooling, so insulation, windows, air tightness, the efficiency of your heating and cooling systems, and duct losses. And then in red is everything else: water heating, ventilation, lights, and appliances. And one thing you find is that in single-family homes, you have a fairly large space used by a small number of people with a lot of surface area. And so in single-family homes, these blue items, the envelope heat loss and gain, tends to dominate, and it's really important to do a really good job on those blue items. And not to say you can ignore the other ones, they also are important, but you'll see huge improvements in the blue envelope areas. When you get to multifamily, the bigger the building and the smaller the dwelling units, the more the red items tend to dominate, because no matter how small the apartment is, people still use the same amount of hot water. They still need the same amount of ventilation air. The lights become a larger percentage of the total energy use, and as do the appliances. A small apartment has a refrigerator and a large house has a refrigerator. So in a small apartment, the refrigerator accounts for a larger percentage of the energy use. And so I find that in multifamily apartments, you need to have a good envelope, but if you're really needing to make a big change in that index, you're probably going to have to look down in these red items and really make sure you've done the best possible thing in those areas to hit those really low indexes. Next slide. So I think a lot of people have become accustomed to what's needed to hit a HERS index of 55 because the stretch code has required that level for a while now. And you can have somewhat of an intuitive design process where I'm designing a pretty efficient building. Let's see what the index is, but I'm pretty sure it'll be enough to meet the stretch code. For meeting an index that's better than 45, it will take some time for designers and everyone else to kind of get used to what do we need to do to hit that type of index. And there's no magic formula that will guarantee that you hit that index. However, what I've done here is kind of lay out what I would typically recommend to someone who wants to hit a HERS index better than 45. And so from an insulation standpoint, the most important thing is that you have some continuous insulation in every assembly of the building. So in other words, if you have a wall system, you have rigid exterior sheathing that's insulated on the outside of the walls, so that even the heat that flows out through the wood stud or metal stud has to flow through that continuous rigid insulation. That will have a bigger improvement on the index than bumping up the cavity insulation a bit. So that's probably the most important insulation item. Windows, you're typically looking at a triple paned window when we look at these low HERS indexes. Air tightness, I have two different targets for single family homes shooting for less than 1 air change per hour. That's what this abbreviation stands for. ACH 50 means air changes per hour at 50 pascals, which is a blower door test pressure. Or for multifamily, it's typically based on the surface area of the apartment or condo. So you have a 0.30 CFM 50, that's the airflow through the blower door per square foot of the shell of that apartment or condo. So getting nice air tightness helps. And then heating and cooling systems. Sometimes designers will say, you know, I've got a 98% gas heating system. That's about as good as it gets, right? However, heat pump systems, the most efficient heat pump systems will use less energy and get a better HERS index than the most efficient fossil fuel systems. And that's really primarily because heat pump systems don't have to make heat. And so instead they move heat from one place to another. So they can gather heat from the outdoors and bring it into the house more efficiently than you can create heat. And then the last envelope item here I have is getting your ductwork inside the conditioned envelope so that you don't really have much for duct losses. Having your ductwork in the attic is a loss that you may not have room for if you're trying to hit a HERS index of 42 or 45. And then in things other than the heating and cooling loads, water heating, either a heat pump water heater or a very efficient gas water heater, something like an on-demand gas water heater, although that will kick you into the mixed fuel category in the ERI path. You'll note I did not include electric resistance storage tank water heaters, kind of standard electric tank water heaters. Those would allow you to stick with the all electric path, but they have a pretty big penalty in terms of energy because whereas heat pumps get to move heat, electric tank water heaters are making heat with electricity, and that's just not a very efficient process. I often see things like a 5 to 8 HERS index penalty for going to an electric tank water heater compared to a heat pump or efficient gas water heater. So if you're going for a 45 HERS index, you may not have room for that hit. Ventilation under the new stretch code, every home and every apartment or condo should have an ERV that will help with these HERS indexes, and depending on the code you're under, it may be a mandatory requirement to begin with. And getting the airflow right. There's too little airflow, which is not enough to meet air quality needs, and there's too much airflow where you're creating an energy loss without needing that much airflow for air quality. Lights, LED, that's easy, and appliances, you will see some good improvement from efficient refrigerators and efficient clothes washers, and making sure that those are part of your specification and that they're installed before the home gets its final inspection and testing.
Okay, Mark, I think I take it from here, right?
I think so.
Okay. So, well, thank you, Mark. And appreciate one of the things that we've talked about right to this point is sort of the theory of how this all works. And I like there's a Yogi Berra quote that I've always liked. That at least it's attributed to Yogi Berra, but it's that in theory, there's no difference between practice and theory, but in practice there is. And I think what we find on the construction site is in order to hit the targets, it really comes down to how the team comes together and performs. So a little bit of what I'm going to talk about here, or most of what I'm going to talk about here, is what we've experienced in building homes at HERS 42 and below. And I think what we find is it really just does come down to the first thing is getting the players together early. And by bringing people together early, you can benefit from the different insights and experiences people have. And sometimes you'll find cost saving opportunities or other efficiencies that way. More importantly, I think you surface any sort of obstructions to the goal. We have had some folks on our team, so I'll speak to what our supervisors, we've had some supervisors who question the sort of the societal value of these regulations, or just the need for energy regulations in the building code. If you can get those folks focused on the idea that this is how quality is defined, the quality of construction, and also give them targets. And we have guys who will be skeptical about the need for this, who are bragging and celebrating their air infiltration scores and their HERS ratings on the homes that they're building. So it's really just focusing people on the goals and keeping the conversation there. I think you can start to unlock the potential of the construction team. I mentioned that we have guys celebrating the outcomes, so the HERS scores or the air infiltration. And part of that's because up front, we're talking about what are the project specific targets and what are the things we're going to be doing on the project to achieve the targets. So really trying to get into, it's not just air sealing, it's what's the detail at the sill. If you're going to wrap the air membrane or the air barrier from the inside of the sill, fold it over the top before you start the framing, so you can get that tight envelope. And also what Mark was talking about, the sub-slab insulation and making sure that that's sealed to the base of the foundation as well, so that you don't get air infiltration between the slab and the foundation wall. A couple of things we also try to emphasize is there's two types of inputs that go into the HERS model. And Mark, I think, was talking about the envelope versus sort of the use. Another way we think of it is there are factors that go into the HERS model that are really fixed factors. The R value is going to be determined by whether or not you install the continuous rigid insulation. And so we know we're going to install it, so that part of the HERS score is essentially fixed. The one that we really have more control over on site is the air infiltration. So the building what's shown on the drawings, putting in the correct materials, that's the basic blocking and tackling. We don't think as much about that. We really focus people on the variable stuff on site. This next point here about ensuring that there's clarity and competence. I think the idea about competence, it's somewhat loaded. We use the word here just to mean, do people know what they're doing? Do they have the skill? Have they been trained to do it? If you give somebody a task to do, but they don't know how to do it, they can go in with all the right intentions, but they aren't necessarily going to achieve the outcomes. So we first start just by having the conversation to understand with our team, but also the subcontractors, have you installed a Zender ERV before? And that's a particular brand, but if they've used different ERVs, their familiarity with that product may be lacking. And so you need to make sure that you get them up to speed and that you take the steps to develop their competence in working with that ERV. Similarly, with some of the air sealing products we use, one of the issues we've run into is the compatibility between different products. So you have tapes and membranes, and if the tapes and membranes aren't compatible, they might stick on day one, but not long down the road, you're going to lose that seal. So this links to the idea of competence. To people, do they know how to do the proper taping and sealing? Clarity, do they know which materials to use? And then this next one about ownership and how things connect. If you've got a guy on site who runs out of tape and he sends a laborer or somebody that's not necessarily in the loop to go get more tape, guy gets to the lumber yard or wherever it is, they don't have the tape he's looking for. He goes and he talks to somebody at the lumber yard. gets something different, comes back, and they keep moving. And the way that we try to prevent those things from happening is really including everybody at every level of the project in the understanding of the goals and the importance of their role to the outcome. So it's a little bit of flipping what the traditional job site used to be. The traditional job site 20, 25 years ago, the supervisor knew everything, subs operated largely in silos, and the supervisor orchestrated everything. And supervisor made sure things, connected as needed. In today's job site, it can be the lowest paid laborer on the job who has the biggest impact on the air sealing at the end of the day. Because you might have all these people going around paying attention. You have an electrician apprentice who goes and needs to move an outlet, digs out a bunch of insulation, cuts a hole in the air barrier, doesn't understand how that hole is linked to the overall goal. And the next thing you know, you miss it, you get to that final blower door test and you don't understand where that big air leakage is coming from. And it could just be a few of these holes that have been cut by someone lower on the team. So it's making sure everybody's clear on the goals, competent, and that it happens at all levels of the project. And then the other piece here is one way to really just test the competence and to perfect or refine the skill is to do mock-ups. We bring all the different players who will touch a window or an opening to put in the first one. Everybody talks, we sometimes go forward and backwards until we get the process refined so that everybody that's going to touch that opening understands what they're doing and is doing the most efficient process. The testing side of this, we test early and often. So early on, we do blower door tests. We're really just looking for big leaks. We don't even look at the actual rating. We're just trying to identify where air is moving. And then as we add layers to the construction, we've tested buildings before windows are in, just taping over the windows and getting a sense of where things are. You might have one wing of a building that's done and test that wing by sealing that off from the rest. But really, it's just using the blower door as a tool to make sure that every step of the way you're maximizing the opportunity to get the result. The longer you wait, the harder it is to go back and seal stuff up. Last point here is making sure that the final test follows protocols. And this was a conversation that Mark Newey and I and the team had about. There can be a lot of variation in the actual results depending on how the HERS rater performs the test. One, there's a study, and I believe we have it in the resources at the end, but there's a study that shows HERS raters, multiple HERS raters working on a single house to just see how consistent they are and seeing 10-point variation. And some of that variation is, I think, driven by the load that's put on HERS raters. Some of these HERS raters are doing so much volume that they don't have the time to check everything along the way. And I think other things we've experienced are HERS raters who have come to the site didn't have the proper aperture for their blower door or other things that they weren't prepared for because of the nature of the home. So just really making sure that the test is there's good dialogue with the HERS rater. I mean, HERS raters that we've worked with know a lot, but they work in such a variety of homes that when they come to one of the homes we're working on, it's really helpful to have conversations with them about what they're experiencing and how they're going to work with the house that we've built. And then the final thing, I think we look to measure the actual results. And this is something that's not so much related to the code, but it's related to trying to achieve the outcomes that the code is looking for. We put in energy monitoring systems so that we can see when something starts to go off the tracks. We've had air source heat pump hot water heaters where there's been coolant leaks or refrigerant leaks. And so they switch over to electric boost. And as Mark was saying, it's more efficient to move heat than it is to make heat. If an air source heat pump hot water heater is failing in heat pump mode, but it has the electric boost backup, that just becomes the equivalent of an old resistance electric hot water heater. you can catch things like this if you have the energy monitoring systems. Likewise, you might get a client that calls you because they see their energy bill go up, and now you're in troubleshooting mode. If you don't have that energy monitoring system, it can be pretty difficult to figure out where the problem occurs within the home. And another thing that we've done is we've done indoor air quality testing and move-in, and after a period of occupancy. Again, this is a little bit outside of the HERS conversation, but it does relate from our perspective. You go in there, and the more you're going back and measuring results, the more opportunity you have to learn about what works and what doesn't work, and bring it back into the beginning of this whole process for the next home. So that's a little bit of what we've experienced on site, and just, you know, more specific, if we go to a case study here, and so you can jump to the next slide. So this is a home that we're working on in Brookline. Now, it was permitted before the code was updated, but it is projected to meet the new code. It's a residence. And I will say, you know, we as a company, we're very fortunate. I think a lot of folks in this Boston area, we're fortunate to work with clients who value the outcomes and are willing to invest in the quality of construction to achieve the outcomes. So here, the house is, it's a gut renovation of a brick home in a historic district. That's leading us to insulate on the inside of the wall. And that, of course, changes the interior rim dimensions. The Historic Commission required the use of single pane true divided light windows. And we can still use exterior storm windows, but again, much lower performance than what we would have hoped for if we'd been able to use even a vacuum insulated IGU as instead of a triple pane. Solar's not permitted here. So we have a few things that we're set up with that are a little bit of handicap when it comes to trying to achieve the HERS rating. So what we ended up doing in the plan, it's got all electric systems within the RV. We set an achievable air infiltration target of 2 ACH50. So we feel we expect to beat that substantially, maybe even get below 1. But by modeling the 2 ACH50, we're giving ourselves a little bit of a buffer. We have a very detailed air sealing plan, and we've got multiple blower door tests happening at different phases of the project. The wall, roof, and foundation insulation, we increased those to compensate for the energy loss of the single pane windows. And then because it's an old brick home and we're changing the thermal property and the drying potential of the wall, we engaged a masonry consultant to advise on the wall assembly details. So if you can go to the next slide, what we found here was it really required, before the design got rolling full speed, it really required early phase collaboration and iteration. So we established the goals, the client, the architect, and the builder. And the goals, as I said, you know, the idea would be try to get net zero. Because of some of the constraints, we're not going to be able to hit net zero. So we're looking to get the home as efficient as possible. We then took that, modeled different options to understand what it would actually yield. And that's how we ended up with the extra insulation going into the basement. And then also the confirming the assumptions. So we built this, or we came up with the concept, but we also knew that the home's in a historic district, and you know, it's a fossil-free, Brookline is a community that was embracing the fossil-free construction, but they also have historic regulations. And so we're right at this intersection of these two different objectives within the town. So going to the different boards, the different people in the town to talk through what's possible, going to different hearings, that's when we learned that these different solutions we had suggested for the windows wouldn't work. With respect to historic, it loops us back to modeling different options to still try to achieve the goals. I think here, it was one of the things that happened is because we're now going to, we're increasing the insulation on the basement. From the client's perspective, it created an opportunity. There was now a reason to do more modifications to the basement in order to pursue their goals. And so they increased the basement program. I think it's, again, it goes back to, we're fortunate that we're working with folks who can embrace these kind of opportunities, but it's this early phase schematic collaboration and iterating through this by including more people in the conversation that it then allows you to move forward really rapidly and design with clarity. And the one other point I would say is, for us, we're builders. We advocate for being at the table early, because our experience through the last 50 years is that the more, when we're involved in the conversation, early on and are talking about the practical things that happen on site, the rest of the process moves more smoothly. We've also been in a number of projects where clients don't want the builder at the table early. They want to keep the builder at arm's length and then bring the builder on through a competitive process. So they're cutting out that collaborative potential. One way you can try and accomplish that, if you're working with clients who just do not want the builder to be participating too early, we've had really good luck working with like Building Science Corporation. I know COTE has worked on a number of our projects through the years. John and Joe, that team over there. And then Jordan Goldman from Zero Energy Design has been working on a lot of projects. There's others, and I'm just singling those two out because we've worked with them and we've seen that as a reasonable substitute for having the builder at the table. But you really want people who are going to be able to comment on the construction details, so that the design and what will happen downstream sync up early. So with that, I will turn it over to Michelle.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark and Laura. So I'm definitely not a HERS expert. I totally second everything that has been said so far, that there's no magic solution for hitting HERS 42 or 45 or whatever. It depends on so many factors. It depends on the density, the building type, the envelope, etc. We at Icon Architecture do a lot of large-scale multifamily projects, so we don't always have a HERS rating. But I wanted to sort of touch on an example where we did, to highlight the critical importance of air infiltration. So we do a lot of passive house work. We have 3 projects that are completed and certified. We have 5 more in construction and like 15 more in design. And passive house has a lot of the same fundamental priorities and inputs that as Mark described, go into ecotrope or room rate, whatever you're using to model a HERS score. It cares a lot about heating and cooling, but infiltration is really, at the end of the day, critical. And if you don't hit it, if you don't hit the low bar, or the high bar, I guess we should say, the low number that passive house expects, you just don't get there. You don't get certified. So this is a project that wasn't pursuing passive house, but it's a multifamily townhome project in South Boston, where we had 2 inches of continuous insulation on the exterior. And Mark talked about, there's sort of these intuitive things that designers start to get comfortable with. 2 inches seems like a pretty solid housing. On a single family home, you might need a little bit more, maybe, with that surface to volume ratio. But the air, so we had 2 inches of continuous insulation. We had high performance systems. It's not fossil fuel free, although that won't happen going forward in the city of Boston. And we have 2 very different HERS scores, 2 very different situations, and it is entirely due to a difference in infiltration. So I think so much of what has been said, I concur with. Testing early and often, kind of understanding the craft of building. So when my first passive house project, I was all about like, this has to be an airtight building, blah, 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 blah. And I was really freaking everyone out. I've since learned, as Mark kind of pointed out, every trade is just a craft. And if you just help them to do it to the best of their ability and explain that what you're looking for is quality, folks will inherently rise to the occasion. They do know what they're doing. Each trade knows what they're doing. And if they need a little bit more education, we can give it to them. But the folks who install air barriers, they know how to do that. And the mock-up is a wonderful way to kind of evaluate if we're able to do it at scale. In this case, our issue was actually less, and New Ecology was actually on this project, was less about the air barrier to the exterior, which was pretty continuous and not such a huge issue. The bigger issue was compartmentalization to the interior, which is also important, especially in multifamily, where you've got demising walls and units next to units and above units. And you want to make sure not only that there's good acoustic separation, but that no one's smelling what you're cooking next door. And so I guess the range here, look at this air tightness range at ACH 50, like 4.62 at our best end, 8 on the worst end, right? So it's almost twice as leaky. And the vast majority of that leaking was happening inside the building between units, not to the exterior. If we go to the next slide, we will see the culprits, the types of culprits. It's not uncommon at all. There are things that penetrate the ceiling assembly, the floor ceiling assembly, which is not only an important air barrier, but is also an important fire rated separation in a multifamily situation. So sprinklers, conduits, ductwork. In some of the projects I've got under construction right now, where we're doing, to Mark's point, early blower door testing to try to find the big issues. Let's not worry about the number, but where is air moving and why? Like, what happened? Because we can design it with the best of intentions, but it ultimately relies on execution. So working with the builder, having them on early is fabulous, because this is obvious, not always prescriptive. This is a performance focus, and there's lots of ways to get there. And so how do you, not just to have them on early to help us with some detailing, but also to evaluate different choices we're making, assemblies, et cetera, and make sure that we're doing it in a cost-effective way and an achievable way. And I can't tell you how many times we get together with our builder and we talk through a detail that is really important, and they kind of, it's the quintessential architect builder conversation where the builder's like, I don't know what that detail is, but we can't build it that way. that doesn't even work, And I'm like, oh, darn, we've had this detail in our set for like 20 years. No one ever told us that before. So, having the builder on board early to think through assemblies, cost-effective ways to achieve the outcome and the goals, and then certainly testing to evaluate unintended leakages, right? This wasn't on purpose. Someone just didn't finish the job, right? It's a team effort. It's not a blame game. It's totally not about that. It's sort of, how do we all do our best work together? And air tightness, again, it's kind of everything. Like Mark said, the R values are the R values. You're going to ultimately, the modeling or whatever is going to show you the windows that you're using, the exterior assemblies that you're planning for. But if you don't hit the air tightness, it can have wildly different effects on the actual final outcome.
Michelle, could I just jump in real quick on this slide? Because I think this is a great, the point you're making, that sprinkler head is analogous to what I was saying, where we see with outlets being moved after the air sealing's been done. And I think this is a really, just the way you're talking about the need for everybody to come together and solve problems. One of the things we saw early on, I'm talking 10, 15 years ago, when we were really trying to get tight buildings and 0.5 ACH 50 ratings, is you'd get to the blower door test at the end, and the test would be 1, and you're shooting for 0.5. And the first thing that the supervisor wants to do is call the like the guy who put in
Aero barrier. Yeah,
right?
totally. Yeah.
You know, because he's thinking, hey, you know, we hired a sub to do the air sealing on this building, and that sub failed. And because this sub's business is air sealing, that's the first person you call. But the reality is the problem occurred because somebody who doesn't even think of themselves as related to air sealing the building, they just did what they've been doing for 20 years. You know, there's a lot of things that have happened that are changing. And unless we bring all those people along and make everybody part of the team, you'll see this kind of thing over and over, where that you've now called out the air barrier, the guy who put in the air barrier. He points at the hole that the electrician or the sprinkler guy cut in it. He's
Right.
pissed because he's wasted his time coming out to deal with this. And you're creating more conflict on the job site. Whereas if people understood up front their part in the system, I think you end
Right.
up with just so much more potential on the team.
And every trade matters. I do a lot of presentations on this. The electrician matters. What is he penetrating? He, you know, the plumber matters. What's coming through the slab? What's going through the roof? It all matters. So, yeah, I absolutely. I think when we empower people to and value what they do, we get a better outcome. That's the, you know, building is a beautiful thing. It's a craft. And if we just acknowledge that from all trades, I think they rise to the occasion. As you said, they celebrate their successes. They feel really proud about what they accomplished. You know, the ductwork team on my large multifamily buildings has to do a lot of work to make sure that ductwork is tight. You can't move air around efficiently if your ductwork is leaky, right? So it's every trade. And if we just think of it like that, I think we can kind of reimagine building as it once was, right? Which is a beautiful craft, not sort of a whatever. I think the next slides move on to maybe some resources. Yep, there we go.
Thanks, you all.
We'll just maybe, sorry, can I interject one more moment? This
Sure.
point of the blower door testing and like what you find. So on our third passive house project, we were in our final testing, we had fog to evaluate a couple of very specific weak points. And we finally tightened them all up. And the building was so tight that there was like this little whistle happening in the building that we could all hear on a floor that was not where we were worried about. And we tracked it down, and it turned out that one window, a gasket on the bottom of the sash. That's how tight I understood that, unless we had tested and gotten to that place. And so clearly we were able to rectify that. But it's incredible what you can discover, again, unintended or unexpected when you test.
Cool story, Michelle. It's always fun things like that you find. So anyone that is interested in getting these slides, so you can have all of these links, you can send an email to me. It's anash@sasaki.com, and I'll email it out a PDF within the week. I wanted to first of all just go through the chat and pick up any questions there that were answered, and then I'm going to open up to for I'm going to stop sharing so we can all see each other. So going back through the chat, it looks like Ian Finlayson of DOER is also here. So we'll start with the presenters, and if we want to kick anything to DOER, we can do that. But he pointed out that an important point about the base energy code and the timeline of that. as a state, we're anticipating getting to public hearings on the 10th edition, which is IECC 2021, the base code, sometime in the fall. But however, this is important because, you know, it affects those 51 communities, but not the stretch code communities. So that's an area that some folks may be confused about. But basically, if you're in a stretch code community, you already know what your energy code is. And the base code, the life, health, and safety things that are going to update with the 10th edition, those will come later. We addressed the slides. David Asher asked, what are the goals of the HERS Rater Foundation inspection? And I think Mark Newey, that was on one of your slides, if you want to answer that.
I think I answered that when the question came through, but it was to look at the exterior insulation that might be on the outside of the foundation walls or underneath the slab, as well as to look at the vapor barrier or air barrier under the slab, and to talk about what's going to need to happen during framing that's about to happen, that's really good timing for. Sometimes you have a pre-construction meeting to talk about air sealing and all of these concepts, but construction is still 4 months out. By the time you start, nobody can remember that conversation. So often the biggest advantage to a foundation inspection is to be talking about what's about to happen literally days later, while it's going to be fresh in everyone's minds.
Great, thank you.
If I could chime in on that, on larger projects, like we do, contractors often have a 3-week look ahead. Maybe that happens on smaller projects too. And I have learned over the years that it's useful to think in the builder's language. What's happening over those next 3 weeks? Let's look at any detail that might be cropping up that's related to air tightness or tricky transition or an insulation, you know, whatever, and just make sure that the right trades have that pre-construction conversation so that you do it right the first time instead of having to go back and remediate after the fact.
There's also a question about the historic, what qualifies as historic. And I think there's language within the stretch code that I would refer everyone to read, and also, you know, discuss with the AHJ if you have a question. And, you know, if Ian, if you have any other things you'd like to talk about, I think that's kind of a lot of us are looking for clarification on what qualifies as historic.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. So the definition of historic or how historic is treated in the Energy Code actually comes from the IECC model code language, and we don't change it in the Massachusetts Stretch Code. So there, I don't have it in front of me right now, but there's a paragraph in there that basically says if a home or building is in a historic district and is a listed building, or if a specialist can vouch that it would be a listed building, then if meeting the Energy Code would damage the historic fabric, and that's an important clause, then that building can be exempted from the Energy Code. So if you're looking at doing something that isn't going to impact the historic fabric of the building, then there's not an automatic out from the Energy Code there. But if, for example, as is common, the Historic Commission says, we want you to keep a certain style of window, then there's no requirement to comply with the Energy Code requirements. So just having to have historic windows means that you don't have to meet HERS 52 today or 42 or 45. in the future. And that's going to be very impactful, I think, for projects in that area. I think it's awesome the work that Thought Forms is doing for customers that want to meet that target voluntarily, but they're not actually mandated to do that in that situation.
Yeah,
That's a great
actually,
point.
thanks for pointing.
There, you know, if the building is over 20,000 square feet is in Boston, then you also have to look at the energy disclosure stuff, or, you know, you may have, if it's a smaller building on, you know, a townhouse as part of a, you know, another community that wants to get to net zero, or there's decarbonization goals. A lot of times, you know, the code is now the floor, and it's a higher floor than it used to be, but there are always opportunities to do more within the same budget to reach other goals as well.
Yeah, and I would just add that we're now seeing projects where the Historic Commission is allowing improved windows. So, for example, there's a mill renovation in Lawrence where they're using much better windows that are much better windows from an energy performance standpoint, I should say, that are meeting the Historic Commission requirements. And so it doesn't mean that you can't make a better building just because it's a historic building, but the code isn't what's driving those projects.
Beth Worrell had a question about, you know, what qualifies as an addition or significant interior renovation, and Mark answered that pretty thoroughly in the chat. If anyone has a question about that, you can take a look at that text. And then there's another question for Mark Newey. Says, you showed a kit of parts for hitting HERS 45. In your experience, is this a conservative package that is likely to hit in all cases, but you might be able to back off based on other characteristics? Example, triple glazing works if there's a higher glazing ratio, but you could back off to high performance double at a lower glazing ratio, or has triple been pretty necessary in all cases to hit 45?
That's a great question. And thank you, COTE, for that. I was actually thinking about that as I was reading the bullets, because like you say in your question, if you have a building with 15% glazing area, the windows performance is a lot less important than if you have a building with 40% glazing. And so I guess I would say it's not, but I also wouldn't necessarily say it's a conservative kit of parts. I would say that it's like it's a starting point. It's a default that for a typical home or typical dwelling unit, if you start with those assumptions, you should be in about the right place. The particular, and then within the suggestions that I listed, there's still quite a bit of range of how good each of those are. So, you know, I said continuous insulation, but obviously a basement that has R10 rigid foam board as the only insulation will not perform nearly as well as, you know, an R20 or an R30 in the basement. And those will certainly impact the HERS index. So your specific R values will swing it a few points. Your windows are going to be affected equally by the amount of windows and the performance of the window. Heat pumps I listed as an important starting point, but heat pumps have a wide range of performance as well. And so you might have a HSPF, or heating seasonal performance factor, anywhere from 7 to 13. That specific model will have a pretty big impact that you pick. Again, heat pump water heaters, same idea. It could be anything from a solar assisted heat pump water heater with a 2 energy factor to some kind of advanced, maybe, you know, a Mitsubishi VRF system with a 4 COP or EF. And so there's an ERVs, the same thing. You could have anything from a 65% recovery efficiency to a 90% recovery efficiency, and that will have an impact. And so, but those all tend to be, you know, a point or two swing in each direction. And so if you pick the best window, the higher R values, the best heat pump water heater, you have a chance, the best ERV, you have a chance of getting down to like a 30 index. And if you pick the worst on that list, you know, I don't know where you'll land, but it could be in the mid to upper 40s, and maybe you won't quite qualify. So I would say it's a great starting point that in most cases will land you in the 40 to 45 range. And then if you tweak each of the items on that list, you can bump that index a point or two up or down to save money or to make a higher performing building. Or if you really are smart, do both at the same time.
Thank you.
If I could add, Mark, if I could just add, because we talked about that air change or the air infiltration target that you had of a 1 ACH 50. And given that one is variable to the performance on site, we often try to go in with a target of 2, or we try to model a 2 ACH 50 and make sure that we've got the HERS rating with a 2 ACH 50. And then we usually come in closer to 1 or below, and then we're clear. Going in with a target of 1 ACH 50, and that is an absolute requirement to getting your HERS rating, particularly on renovations. If you're at a 1.2, or you set yourself up for these challenges. So we do try to build a buffer in there. And then just one other thing, and this is more about, again, it's less about getting the numbers right and satisfying the code, and it's more about the intent. You're mentioning the air source heat pump hot water, and it just, I go back to this idea of measuring what we actually get done after the fact. And we've had a couple of homes where the energy use has been much higher than people anticipated, including the engineers who did the design. We went in and discovered that the heat pump, the air source hot water heat pump is, or I'm sorry, the air source, yeah, the domestic hot water, it's drawing way more energy than is expected. You get the plumber in there, you get the rep in there, and they say, oh, you have it set on eco mode. And you would think that eco mode would be the efficient mode. But they said, no, if you want the thing to operate most efficiently, don't use eco mode, use heat pump mode. And so there's just a switch that toggles it over to always using the heat pump, because when it's in eco mode, as soon as you draw the tank down a certain amount, it kicks back into an electric resistance heating. So
that's very confusing.
Is operating very, at a very poor performance. And the manufacturer just, they know this, but it's not intuitive to people on the site. And without being able to measure that, you might have a house that hits the HERS targets, but then ends up using a lot more energy than necessary. And likewise, a lot of recirculation pumps have smart logic built into them that they will learn the occupants' timing of using hot water. And a lot of plumbers don't know that these new pumps have that. They're just putting in the new pump. They don't program the thing to run for the first 5 or 6 days of occupancy. It doesn't learn the patterns of the occupants and ends up running 24/7 on the recirc line. So these just goes back to, a lot of the things that we spec and that we put in, if they aren't understood and how they're going to work and measured, we can end up with the wrong, missing the outcomes that we're shooting for.
I would also just add, again, I'm not a HERS expert, but I am, but the passive house approach, I think, is the right basic mindset, everything that goes into that model. And we have definitely seen, we do a lot of early feasibility studies. Now that MassSave has this wonderful refund up to $5,000 for the early modeling. So we do a lot of that early modeling before we have everything figured out, just to kind of dial in insulation, et cetera, orientation, solar heat gain. And we have tested, because most clients ask, do you really need triple glazed? Really? Do we really? Can we get away with double pane? Even on multifamily, we have yet to find double pane windows working and those are dense projects that are typically cooling demand is typically our biggest issue, not heating. But so I'm hard pressed to imagine that double paned windows would actually work. Understanding the ratios, et cetera, maybe if you only had 10% glazing or something, but we're usually under 20 and we still can't get it to work in our multifamily buildings.
There's a comment in here from Ian. Thank you for posting the IECC residential chapter language in there. Was there anything, Ian, you wanted to add to what you quoted?
Well, I was actually going to chime in on the double glazed versus triple glazed. So for single family, more so than multifamily, we the team that did the analysis for us early on in the stretch code development, they ran hundreds of thousands of models, but hundreds of models at HERS 42 and HERS 45. And we found that triple glazed showed up as, recommended in maybe 50 to 60% of the model runs, and double glazed in 40 to 50%. And really it comes down to more to window design and layout, whether it's worth paying for triple glazed or not. So I would say it's definitely a consideration that teams should think about, particularly with the incremental price of some triple glazed windows coming down quite a lot. But it's not a requirement. It's obviously you have to find the savings somewhere else, but it's a choice.
There's one advantage to triple glazed or a higher performance window that we haven't mentioned, and that's its impact on comfort and indoor air quality. We've all probably been in older homes in the winter when it's cold outside and there's condensation on the inside of the frame. That's a mold risk that you are not going to have with a very high performance window. So there's some things you can look at embodied carbon, you can look at mold risk, you can look at thermal comfort, you can look at energy savings. But at the end of the day, the best window you can afford and that reduces that condensation risk, you're going to end up with a more durable construction. There is a question in here from Amy to Mark Doherty specifically. How do you have a conversation with clients about energy monitoring systems, and what are your top 3 things to monitor?
So the conversation about the energy monitoring is really, if clients are interested in the performance of their home, it's talking to them about understanding what's happening. And it's a little bit of what you see with people drive a Prius. And there was a whole bunch of research early on that people's driving behaviors changed when they had the feedback from the car. And I think you see the same kind of thing in home occupancy, is people start to understand what the loads that they're putting on the house, and you see a change in occupant behavior. And so the idea is if people are interested in the performance of their home, they'll invest up front in the things that are supposed to give them the performance. It's really talking to them about, hey, if you want to benefit fully from what you're doing, you want to know what you want, that feedback. And you also want that feedback over time, because things like, an energy monitoring system won't tell you air infiltration, but you can see differences in the draw on air handler circuits or other things. And that might be indications of equipment wearing out, or that gaskets around windows. Michelle was talking about window gaskets, things like that need to be adjusted. So one of the things we try to inform them, and most people, when they look at that, are interested in having the energy monitoring systems. And I actually have one in my home that we use. It's a Site Sage product. And one of the things that's been helpful is, you know, you're leaving town and you can find out, oh my gosh, did we leave the coffee maker on? Pull up the circuit. And if there's no draw on the circuit, you know, you turned it off. In terms of the different systems and what we monitor, the Site Sage system monitors every circuit. So it just comes down to how you lay out the electrical in the house. If there's something specific you want to monitor, then you need it on a dedicated circuit, or at least you need to know what circuit it's on, and it's labeled into the system. The nice thing, or one of the things we like about the Site Sage system, is that it's, I guess in essence, it's a one-way system. You can only see what's happening. You can't change something remotely. There are a lot of new systems coming online. Leviton has a smart panel where it not only monitors the load, but you can turn off breakers remotely or reset things. Some of our clients are worried about the security risk that presents, and just other problems when the system gets too smart. So we've seen more Site Sage systems go in, and there has been at least one home where we covered the installation cost because the client didn't want it, didn't want to pay for it, but through the project and getting to know the client, we knew that we were going to want it when they started to complain at the end about things in their home. And so for, I think it's probably $5,000 investment, we were able to troubleshoot a lot of things that they were unhappy about, and just direct them to things like, this is a silly one, but they had insisted on snow heat trace on the roof, even though it had, I think it was 6 inches of rigid exterior insulation plus dense pack in the rafters. The house tested it, I think, at 0.7 ACH 50. So all the different factors that we were entirely confident that was unnecessary, but their prior home, they had ice dams, and they turned that heat trace on in October, and they left it on until April, and they complained about the energy use in their house. And when they saw how much it cost to run that heat trace, they never turned it on again. So that's I mean, those kind of examples, I think, for people to embrace this, it's really just making it tangible for them and how it's going to have an impact on their life and cost savings. So.
Thank you. We're at time, so I'm going to stop the recording, and this recording will go up on the BSA website hopefully soon. And please email me if you'd like to have the slides in the meantime, and I'll get those to you in a week. Thank you to our presenters, and we'll see you in July at our commercial stretch and opt-in presentation, July 7th. Thank you.
Thanks all.